Before we start today's episode about short-phrased influence techniques, I only have one request for you. If you like the video, if you like psychology in general, feel free to subscribe to the channel or push the like button. But of course, do not feel obliged. And I guess you will probably refuse to do so anyways. Nevertheless, even one little click on the subscribe button would help to spread the video and to make people more aware of these influence techniques. Because these influence techniques are really simple, and I actually just used 4 out of the 5 that I want to present to you right at the start of this video. So the first one was that I said, I only have one request for you. And this is a technique that proved to be successful in a study in which passers-by were asked to donate money for a children's hospice. And of course, later on, all the money was indeed spent for the children's hospice. They were asked if they would make a donation for the children's hospice. But in one group, they were assured by the requester that this is the only request. This is my only request, she said. And in comparison to a control condition in which this phrase was left out, the compliance rate raised from 16% to 55% in the "this is my only request" condition. And the scientists suppose that this technique is so successful because you guarantee to the other person that after you took her little finger, you won't go and take her whole hand, because this is something that many people nowadays are used to. When they are asked for a favor by a stranger, it quite often begins with a little request by signing a petition, for example, to save the rainforest. And later on, you are also asked, because you already made a public commitment that it is very important for you to save the rainforest. Later on, somebody comes over, maybe some days later, and he rings on your door and he tells you, well, some days ago you signed this petition and you showed that it is very important for you to save the rainforest. Now it's your chance to do something great. Now is your chance to spend some money to actually save the rainforest. So this is the classical foot in the door scenario. You begin with a small request and later on you ask for more. And by assuring the other person that this is my only request, you still have this exit strategy that if the other person comes with a second request, you can say, wait a minute, you said this is your only request, I am out. And it's absolutely okay to leave the scenario in this situation. Of course, there are also some other explanations why this technique might work. If you want, you can take a look at the specific episode on this topic. The second strategy that I used in the beginning was the so-called evoking freedom technique. By saying, don't feel obliged to subscribe to the channel, but of course, feel free to do so if you want or not. And by saying so, I gave you back the feeling of freedom that you can decide on your own. Because whenever somebody tells us something, and this goes back to our childhood, nobody likes it when, for example, your mother tells you to tidy up the room or your father tells you to do your homework, because we don't want to be pushed to do something specific. We want our freedom. And therefore, these phrases like, for example, but you are free to accept or to refuse, or feel free to say no, which was used, for example, in a quite new study in which university students were approached on the campus and they were told by an experimenter, excuse me, my phone is dead. Can I use yours for a moment? And when the students were just asked in this way, only about 45% were willing to give away their beloved smartphone to a stranger. But in the evoking freedom condition, when they were approached by saying, excuse me, my phone is dead, can I use yours for a moment, but feel free to say no. When this very short little phrase was added, and this shows how easy those influence techniques can be implemented, when this little phrase was added, the compliance rate raised from the 45% in the control condition to up to 95% in the evoking freedom condition. So almost everybody now was willing to give away the beloved smartphone to a stranger, which can be quite problematic because maybe the stranger installs a virus, or he calls a very expensive number, or he just takes the phone and runs off. So if you find yourself in this situation one day, maybe you remember this episode and you can use this phrase to make an emergency call. Even though the research on the evoking freedom technique is not that old yet, it is already quite extensive, because up to now there have been studies with more than 18,000 participants, and one quite interesting pattern that could be shown in these studies, of course there will have to be more research on that, was that in more collectivistic cultures, like for example in China, the technique does not work that well. Instead, the technique works very fine in individualistic countries, like for example in France or in the United States, because in those countries, this at least might be a quite plausible explanation, because in those countries, personal freedom is very important for most people. In those cultures, people want to be able to develop freely, and they don't want to be told what they have to do. And therefore, it's very effective in these cultures if you evoke freedom by using this technique, by saying, for example, but of course you are free to accept or to refuse. The third technique that I used in the beginning was to say, even one little click on the subscribe button would be helpful. And this technique has been extensively tested in scenarios in which people were asked to make donations to charity organizations. So for example, people were asked, would you donate some money for the following charity organization? Even a penny will help. And by adding this phrase, in many studies, the compliance rate could be raised drastically, probably because if you add this phrase, it becomes very difficult for the other person to turn down the request, because come on, you can always give one penny. Even if you have only a little bit money yourself, you can still afford to give one penny, right? And in most cases, of course, as soon as people take out their wallet, they don't give just one penny. They, more often than not, they give much more than just one penny, because nobody wants to look like an asshole. Technique number 4 is the so-called "you will probably refuse but" technique, which is a very clever technique, because by using this phrase, you create reactance in the other person, because you tell the other person, you are not the person who will do that. So for example, you go to somebody on the street, to a stranger, and you ask him for some money, and you say, you will probably refuse, but would you give me €2 that I need for the bus? Or for example, if you're into skydiving, you go to your partner and you say, there is a discount on skydiving, but you will probably refuse to do that. Today's last technique is just to ask the other person, how are you? How do you feel right now? And most of the time, people feel obliged to say something like, oh, quite okay, very good, I'm good. So more often than not, they answer quite positive. Almost nobody will tell you, well, actually, I feel really bad. I had a bad day. I have a headache and my grandmother is in hospital and I really feel very bad. No. Most of the time, people won't answer like that, because the convention is not to unload your negative feelings on other people. But by answering quite positive, you make yourself quite vulnerable to the so-called foot in the mouth technique, because right after you said, well, actually, I'm quite good, the other person tells you, well, that's great to hear. We are collecting money for the charity organization Help Disabled Kids. And now you are in a dilemma, because you just said that you are actually quite well, you feel really good and everything is fine. Why on earth should you not give some money to people who feel bad? And therefore it's no wonder that in some studies it could be shown that just adding the question, how do you feel right now, actually improved the compliance rates. So these were 5 very effective and extremely simple influence techniques from psychological research. And if you want to know more about these techniques, of course, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Do not feel obliged. I know you will probably refuse to do so, but even one more subscriber would help the channel and would help to spread more psychological knowledge. And then maybe, if you want, we will see you next time.